Yesterday, my husband David and I were sitting in our cozy living room. The world felt quiet, in the quiet of the evening. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the fireplace and the rustle of my blanket. We have been married for 10 years. 10 years, ups and downs and everything. David was my best friend, my rock, my partner in crime. Or so I thought. That night, David looked at me. I couldn't quite make out his expression. It wasn't anger or sadness, but something. He cleared his throat and said, "Honey, I've been thinking about something." Naturally, I prepared myself for it. Maybe it was the bills, the stress of work, or the dream of a surprise holiday. But what he said struck a blow from my mouth to my heart. "I was thinking about spending time with someone else," he said, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding me. I let out a nervous laugh. He had to be joking, but his serious look told me there was nothing wrong. "I mean, what if you just contacted another man?" he added. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. This was the man who had once been jealous because a waitress had smiled too much at him. Now he was suggesting this to me? "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice unintentionally harsh. David leaned forward. His tone was soft but insistent. "I've read about it. Couples bringing someone else into their relationship to spice it up." I felt sick to my stomach. Spice? Was he bored with me? Did he find me boring? I wasn't good enough. And then came the coup de grace. "I know someone," he said. "Jerome. We work out at the same gym. He'd be perfect." It was shocking to hear that. The fact that David had already chosen someone made me both angry and completely upset. Jerome was a tall, confident guy I'd seen a few times at the gym. The moment he walked into his room, he stood out. But I said to David, "Have you lost your mind?" That was crazy. But David kept his cool. "I just want you to think about it," he said. "I think it might bring us closer." That night, as I lay in bed looking up at the ceiling, David's words echoed in my head. Part of me felt that this suggestion was the beginning of the end of our marriage. But another part of me questioned this strange thought. Days passed. David never brought it up again, but his suggestion lingered like a shadow in the house. I realized I was beginning to think about Jerome, uncomfortable with myself. Then one Saturday morning, David announced that Jerome was coming to dinner. I froze. When Jerome arrived, he was even more striking. He impressed with his tall stature, broad shoulders, and warm smile. He was surprisingly pleasant to talk to. I realized he was funny, charming, and talkative. The intensity with which David observed us was unsettling. As the night wore on, I realized that I couldn't help but attract Jerome's attention. That night in bed, Jerome's smile and his voice were running through my mind. A few days later, Jerome texted me. "That was a great dinner. David is very lucky." My heart sped up. Was this just an innocent thank you? That day, I quickly replied to him, but this seemingly harmless conversation became more personal. Jerome would say little things that made me feel like he cared. His concern was both fascinating and confusing. And at that point, I started to feel like I was losing control of my life. This process, which started with David's suggestion, was testing the limits of all of us, but mostly my own. When we got ready to go to Jerome's house that weekend, I felt a kind of uneasiness. David was as calm as ever, even a little too cheerful. It was strangely disturbing to me. On the way to Jerome's house, David told me how beautiful Jerome's house was, but his words didn't really reach me. In my mind, I was constantly questioning where this situation was taking us. When we arrived at Jerome's house, he greeted us with a warm smile. His house was just like him, elegant but cozy. He had set the dining table with care, and the smells emanating from his kitchen showed that Jerome was indeed a wonderful host. But that didn't change a situation that was compounded by an uncomfortable feeling. As the night progressed, it became increasingly difficult to ignore Jerome's interest in me. His jokes, his eye contact, and the way he spoke every word as if he could only hear me. Did David not see that? Or did he see it and ignore it? The thought made me even more uneasy. When the meal was over, Jerome went to the kitchen to serve coffee. David looked at me at that moment and said with a slight smile, "You notice it too, don't you?" Looking puzzled, he added, "That she admires you. It's strange, but maybe it's true." "What are you talking about, David?" I said, my voice a little harsh. But the confusion inside me was reflected in my voice. At that moment, Jerome returned with a tray of coffee. The way David's words hung in the air, combined with the confidence in Jerome's eyes, made everything even more complicated. Jerome handed out the coffee and then turned directly to me. "I hope you enjoyed the evening. David, it is truly an honor to have you here." His eyes locked on mine for a moment, and although I couldn't be sure of what I was feeling, I knew that something would never be the same. There was silence on the way home. David never spoke, and I didn't know what to say. But Jerome's look and David's words were creating a storm in my mind. This journey was a turning point for me. Because the feeling that my life, my marriage, and perhaps myself would take a completely different direction was rooted in me. When we returned from Jerome's house that night, David was silent. But this silence was not a peaceful silence, but the shadow of a thoughtful plan. I couldn't stop Jerome's gaze, the depth of his voice and his touch from echoing in my mind. As soon as we got home, David went to the kitchen and poured a glass of wine. He handed it to me. As I took the glass of wine, he looked me in the eye and said with a wry smile, "I think you and Jerome have a good energy." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying insistence. I looked at her face in surprise. "Is this a joke?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. But what I felt inside was not anger or surprise, but embarrassment and a bit of curiosity. David took a step forward, closer to my face. "No joke," he said in a low voice, not taking his eyes from mine. "I told you I wanted to open this to Jerome because I trust you. And I think maybe you're afraid to really want to." I swallowed, his words echoing through me like a fire. I hadn't expected David to speak so openly, but what surprised me was the way his words made me feel. Jerome's strong hands, his deep voice, and the electric sensation of his presence. I started to think about it again, and I couldn't help it. David took my wine glass from my hand and put it on the table. He put his hands around my waist and said in a low voice, "Don't be afraid. Maybe what Jerome brings will be something we've never felt for each other before. Just feel it," he said. My eyes closed and Jerome's face appeared in my mind's eye. At that moment, attraction and confusion mixed together inside me. David's touch grew closer, but my mind was in Jerome's strong hands. When I realized this, David gently pushed me away from him and said, "If you're not ready, we won't talk about it." But as I watched Jerome talk to you, I realized I hadn't seen you glow like that in a long time. Those words released all the emotions I had been trying to suppress. Jerome's energy, his deep voice, and his gaze. A storm was raging inside me. That night, as David slept next to me, Jerome was the only thing on my mind. And I couldn't close my eyes until the morning because something had changed in my heart. When I opened my eyes in the early morning light, David was still sleeping soundly beside me. I looked at his face, the man I'd known for years, the man I'd built my life with. But the feelings inside me, they weren't the same. Jerome's looks and words that night had touched a part of me that even I didn't realize. David's acceptance and even encouragement of the situation made everything in my head even more complicated. Did his willingness to take this relationship to a different level show his trust in our bond, or was it desperation? Throughout that day, I walked around the house, rethinking everything. Those simple messages Jerome had sent, those seemingly innocent words that carried a spark. And David's persistence. Had we reached a turning point in this marriage? Or was everything beginning to crack? David came to me in the afternoon, sipping his coffee, looking at me in silence. Finally, he spoke. "You know, I haven't seen you so alive in a long time. What happened with Jerome has affected you more than I thought it would. And I know it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. What matters is how you feel." I got tears in my eyes, but I didn't cry. What David said was true. My inner turmoil wasn't just about Jerome. It was about my own wants, my repressed desires, and who I was. Maybe Jerome was just a trigger, but the real issue was my own inner voice, which I had ignored for years. I looked at David and took a deep breath. "I'm grateful to you," I said, "but I must continue this journey alone. I need to find my own feelings and what I want. This isn't about you or Jerome. It's about me." David paused for a moment, then nodded. There was sadness in his eyes, but also understanding. "If that's true for you, then I'll support you," he said. I didn't know where I was going, but I had taken the first step towards finding myself. David was my best friend, and Jerome's attraction was real, but neither of them could fill the real void in my life. A void that I could only fill within myself. It was an ending, yes, but it was also a beginning. An opportunity to rediscover everything about my life. And even though I didn't know what I would encounter on this path, this time I would draw my own direction.